Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so pleased you joined me for today's show. Last week's show was about U.S. locations that are friendly to landlords, but today's show has a different spin. In today's episode, we're diving deep into one very specific question. If you're a real estate investor or an aspiring landlord in Canada, which locations are the most landlord friendly and why? Today's episode is a dedicated show for a podcast-a-thon airing between March 14th and 20th, 2026. Thanks for letting me be a part of that. So instead of racing across all provinces and territories in the Great North, we're going to slow down and spend real time on 5 locations that many investors consider landlord friendly. For each one, I'll walk through the rules, the culture around renting, and the practical pros and cons for landlords. Just a quick reminder, nothing in this episode is legal or financial advice. Residential tenancy rules can and will change, and they can be nuanced. Always double check the current laws in the province you're interested in, and consider speaking with a local lawyer or property manager before making big decisions. With that said, let's jump in, starting with the province that often tops landlord-friendly lists in Canada, Alberta. So now I have done a location specific episode on Alberta. That's episode 166. 166 in the library of My Life as a Landlord if you are interested in Alberta. But let's walk our way through there. When investors talk about landlord friendly places in Canada, Alberta is usually the first name they bring up. The overall theme in Alberta is flexibility for landlords paired with a clear legal framework. That combination makes it attractive to both smaller and larger investors who want predictable rules and the ability to adjust their strategy as markets change. One of the most important reasons Alberta stands out is that it does not have a province-wide permanent rent control in the way most other provinces do. That means within the rules of notice and lease agreements, landlords have more freedom to adjust rents to reflect market conditions. In growing cities like Calgary or Edmonton, that flexibility can be the difference between falling behind inflation and staying ahead of your expenses as things like property taxes and insurance go up over time. Another core feature that investors in Alberta like is the structure around evictions and dispute resolution. The province has a system intended to handle issues such as non-payment of rent, serious lease violations, or damage to the property in a relatively organized and time-bound way. From a landlord's point of view, the key thing is not just that the evictions are possible, but there's a clear process to actually follow with forms, notice periods, and hearings that tend to move faster than in some of the more tenant protective provinces. Security deposits are another area where Alberta is fairly straightforward. Landlords can collect a security deposit, and the rules focus on how it must be handled and when it must be returned. Investors appreciate having the ability to hold a reasonable deposit because it helps protect against damage and unpaid rent, especially in markets where tenant turnover can be high. There's also a cultural and economic aspect to Alberta's landlord friendliness. The province has long been associated with resource industries and relatively business friendly attitude. Investors often find that municipalities and local professionals, such as property managers and real estate agents, are very familiar with rental properties as legitimate business. Now, that doesn't mean there are no tenant protections at all, but it does mean that your role as a landlord is usually recognized as a part of the housing ecosystem rather than something to be discouraged like other locations we've seen. From the practical side, Alberta offers several market types. You have large urban cities like Calgary and Edmonton, where demand can be fueled by jobs and migration, along with similar cities and towns linked to industries like energy services. That variety lets landlords choose between more stable, diversified urban economies and smaller markets that might offer higher cash flow but more volatility. A useful way to think about Alberta is like a toolkit. The law gives you tools to manage risk, such as the ability to adjust rent or eviction for serious problems, while the markets give you different types of properties to choose from. If you're comfortable in doing your homework on specific neighborhoods and you're disciplined about screening tenants and managing leases, Alberta can be a strong province to build a portfolio when you're not constantly running into strict rent caps or extremely low eviction times. Okay, so Alberta is at the top of our list of most landlord-friendly locations in Canada. We're second. How about Saskatchewan? Now, I did do a location-specific episode 147 on Saskatchewan. Jump over there if you want the details. So Saskatchewan is a province that quietly offers many landlord-friendly features without getting as much national attention as Alberta. If Alberta is the well-known front runner, Saskatchewan is the steady runner right behind it. Less flashy, but with a lot of the same advantages from a landlord's perspective. One major reason landlords like Saskatchewan is the relatively low regulatory burden compared to more heavily regulated provinces. While there are clear rules and a dedicated body that handles residential tenancies, the overall framework is often seen as more balanced and more practical for both sides. Landlords typically have defined rights to manage their properties, enforce lease terms, and when necessary, move forward with evictions for non-payments or serious breaches. Rent control is another area where Saskatchewan tends to be friendlier to landlords than in some of the bigger provinces. Historically, Saskatchewan has not maintained the kind of permanent, tight rent caps that you'll see in places like Ontario and British Columbia, which means that landlords can more readily adjust rents at appropriate times, provided they follow the notice rules and any restrictions that may apply to specific types of tenancies. This flexibility is especially important in smaller markets where rents can lag behind costs if they're artificially held down for too long, which we've seen. The enforcement environment in Saskatchewan is also important. Landlords often highlight that while you still need to document issues and follow due process, the system is designed to handle disputes in a way that does not drag on indefinitely, which is key. If a tenant stops paying rent or significantly violates the lease, there is usually a path to address the situation in a reasonable time frame. That reduces the uncertainty that can come from very drawn out hearings and appeals like other locations. Economically, Saskatchewan has a diversified base that includes agriculture, resources, growing urban hubs like Saskatoon and Regina. And for landlords, this means that you can find a range of opportunities, including student rentals near universities, family rentals in suburban areas, and workforce housing in communities connected to agriculture or resource projects. Many of these markets offer relatively affordable purchase prices compared with other parts of Canada, which can make the numbers work better in a cash flow perspective. Culturally, Saskatchewan tends to have a practical look on business and property ownership. Landlords who operate professionally and maintain their properties with clear communication with tenants often find that relationships can be constructive. The laws still protect tenants from unreasonable practices, which they should, but they don't generally make it impossible to enforce lease terms or adjust your strategy when conditions change. For investors, the main considerations in Saskatchewan are to pick markets with solid fundamentals, job stability, demand for rentals, and a realistic view of the population trends, and to understand the provincial tenancy rules in detail. If you do that homework, you may find that Saskatchewan gives you many of the legal advantages you'd expect in Alberta, sometimes even with lower acquisition costs and less competition from large institutional players. So Alberta is first, Saskatchewan is second, New Brunswick is third. Moving east, New Brunswick is an interesting case study in how a smaller province can be still quite attractive for landlords. It's part of the Atlantic region, and over the last several years, it's seen increased attention from investors across Canada who are looking for a combination of reasonable prices and landlord-friendly rules. One reason New Brunswick gets that attention is compared with some of its eastern neighbors, it provides more straightforward environment for landlords. The provincial tenancy framework is designed to outline rights and responsibilities without layering on too many complex restrictions. While tenants are protected from clearly unfair practices, landlords do have room to operate their properties as a business, including making decisions about rent, screening, and lease enforcement within the rules. Rent regulation in New Brunswick has gone through periods of debate, especially as housing affordability has become a national topic. But historically, it has not been extremely tight. Long-term rent controls have it has not been the extremely tight long-term rent controls has seen in other provinces. Goodness sakes, let me go back and read that again. Rent regulation in New Brunswick has gone through periods of debate, especially as housing affordability has become a national topic. But historically, it has not had the extremely tight long-term rent controls seen in other provinces. Whew. This means landlords in New Brunswick can usually raise rents at defined times and in line with market conditions, as long as they respect the notice periods and any caps that may exist at a given point. For long-term investors, that ability to adjust rent helps maintain the viability of their properties as expenses change. Eviction and dispute resolution processes are also a factor in New Brunswick's landlord-friendly reputation. While landlords must follow the correct procedures and provide proper documentation, which is true of any location, the system is generally structured to reach outcomes without years of delay. If a tenant falls significantly behind on rent or engages in serious misconduct, landlords have access to a formal mechanism to resolve those issues, which reduces risk and uncertainty. One advantage in New Brunswick is the relatively affordability of real estate compared to many other parts of central and western Canada. Investors can often acquire properties at prices that make cash flow more attainable, even when rents are lower than the big cities like Toronto or Vancouver. That affordability can also make it easier to diversify. Instead of one expensive unit, you might own several doors across different towns or cities, spreading your risk. Another point investors appreciate is the demographic and lifestyle shift towards smaller cities and towns. Some people are choosing to leave larger urban cities for more affordable, quiet communities, including in New Brunswick. That can support demand for rental properties in places like Moncton, St. John, and Fredericton, as well as surrounding communities that offer a mix of urban amenities and small town life. Now, of course, New Brunswick is not without its challenges. Smaller markets can be more sensitive to local economic swings, and you need to pay close attention to employer stability, industry trends, and population changes. But from a pure regulatory standpoint, many landlords consider New Brunswick one of the more friendly provinces in the East, especially when compared with jurisdictions that have heavier rent controls and more complex eviction processes. Okay, now let's go to a couple of different ones as we round out our top five. Alberta is first, Saskatchewan second, New Brunswick is third, fourth, Manitoba. Now, I did do a location specific episode, episode 131. And if you listened to episode 209, Manitoba is also in the least landlord friendly Canadian location. So, this location is how well you know your tenancy laws. But let's talk about the good aspect. Manitoba's capital, Winnipeg, is a major center for rental housing. And the rules are crafted to manage a specific rental market while still giving landlords room to operate. In Manitoba, the tenancy system is well defined with a dedicated body that handles residential tenancy issues. This institutional structure can be a plus for landlords because it means there's established procedures and forms for addressing common situations, including moving in, moving out, rent increases, deposits, and disputes. And when the rules are clear and accessible, landlords can plan their actions and avoid common pitfalls. Rent regulations do exist in Manitoba, and landlords do need to work within those rules, but the environment is often viewed more as workable than in some provinces where rent controls are extremely tight and long lasting. Manitoba's approach aims to balance tenant protection with the need for landlords to cover rising costs. Depending on the year and the specific framework in place, landlords can typically raise rents with proper notice and within set guidelines, allowing for some growth and income over time. Eviction and dispute resolution are another important aspect. While no landlord enjoys handling evictions, what matters most is whether there is a functioning system that deals with serious cases like chronic non-payment, major damage, or safety issues. Manitoba provides a process where landlords can file applications, present their case, and receive a decision pretty quickly. It is not instantaneous, though, but it is structured in a way that investors can understand and incorporate into their risk calculations, especially when turning over units. Now, from a market standpoint, Manitoba offers both stability and diversity. Winnipeg is a large regional hub with universities, government jobs, and a variety of private sector employers. And that mix creates different types of rental demand, including student housing, workforce rental, family homes. Outside Winnipeg, however, smaller cities and towns can provide opportunities with lower purchasing prices and unique local drivers, such as agriculture, transportation, or manufacturing. Landlords also appreciate that Manitoba's regulatory environment usually encourages professionalism rather than making it impossible to manage a property. So if you maintain your units, follow the rules on notice and documentation, and treat tenants fairly, you can run a rental business without constantly running into extreme limitations on your ability to respond to changing conditions. And that is pretty much standard no matter where you go. The key in Manitoba is understanding that sits somewhere between the very landlord-friendly provinces and the very tenant-protective ones. Manitoba's on the line for sure. You have to respect guidelines on rent increases and tenant rights, but you also have access to processes that can help you enforce leases and protect your investments. For many investors, that balance is acceptable, especially when combined with relatively stable economy and the possibility of building a portfolio in a city like Winnipeg, where demand for rentals has been consistent over time. Okay, rounding out our top five landlord-friendly locations in Canada is Ontario. I know. Episode 124, I did a deep dive location-specific episode, so if you want to know more about this. But our fifth location is Ontario, which, like Manitoba, is also on strong protections and clear rent control. So why include it on a list about landlord-friendly locations in Canada? The reason is that landlord friendliness isn't only about how much rules favor landlords, it's also about the size and the strength of the rental market. The availability of tenants also is in play, and the long term stability of the rental demand in general. Ontario has one of the largest and most active rental economies in the country. For landlords who understand and respect the rules, that scale can make it a powerful place to invest. Let's start with the regulatory side. Ontario's residential tenancy laws are detailed and lean heavily towards protecting tenants from sudden rent hikes, unfair evictions, and unsafe conditions. Rent controls can limit how much you can increase rent for existing tenants, and the eviction process tends to be more structured and often slower than in the more landlord-friendly provinces we've already discussed. But from a pure rules perspective, that is not ideal for landlords who want maximum flexibility. Okay, so that's why it's also on the non-friendly list, right? But on the flip side, Ontario has a strong framework and a clear tenant protection that can create a stable, predictable environment, which is ideal for landlords to operate in. Everyone knows the rules, and professional landlords can design their businesses around them. You factor in rent control into your long term projections, you budget for longer turnover times, and you focus on tenant retention to avoid excessive vacancy. The real advantage Ontario offers is demand. Cities like Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, and many mid-sized communities have experienced long-term pressure on rental housing. There are large populations of students, newcomers, and workers who rely on rentals. High demand can offset some of the regulatory constraints because vacancy rates are often low and well-located, well-managed units rarely sit empty for long. In fact, oftentimes this is what I call a quick change. The outgoing tenant high fives the incoming tenant as they come in the door. So there's almost no time for a unit to be vacant. Another thing to consider in Ontario is appreciation. While cash flow can be tighter in Ontario than lower priced provinces, investors have historically looked to Ontario for long-term property value growth, especially in and around major urban centers. If your strategy includes rental income and long-term appreciation, Ontario's large and dynamic economy can be a significant draw, even if you have to live with stricter rent rules and more complex eviction procedures. From a practical standpoint, being a landlord in Ontario means being highly organized and compliant. Yeah. You need to be meticulous with leases, notices, maintenance, and communication. And if you are not an analytical person, then you need to make sure your property manager or your partner, whoever that is. Many landlords in Ontario build strong relationships with their tenants, focus on high quality units, and aim for longer term tenancy. That model can work very well when you have a steady stream of prospective tenants and a property in a desirable area. So while Ontario may not be exactly landlord friendly in classic legal sense, it makes our list because of the sheer market strength. For investors who are comfortable operating in a more regulated environment and who think rental property. The key is to treat it as a professional, compliance heavy market where your systems and your understanding of the law are just as important as the brick and mortar that you buy. So, to recap the journey we've taken today, Alberta gives you a high flexibility environment with no broad permanent rent control and relatively efficient processes, making it a favorite for investors in Canada. Saskatchewan offers similar advantages on a slightly smaller scale with practical rules and often lower acquisition costs. New Brunswick shows that the Atlantic region can also be attractive, combining comparatively straightforward regulations with growing investor interest and affordable properties. Manitoba sits in a balanced middle ground with workable regulations and a solid hub in Winnipeg that supports a wide range of rental strategies. And Ontario, despite its strong tenant protections, earns a place on this list because of its massive, resilient rental market and long-term growth potential for disciplined landlord. As always, the right location for you depends on your goals, risk tolerance, and investing style. Do you want maximum regulatory flexibility? Or are you comfortable managing in a more controlled environment in exchange for big city demand? Or maybe you prefer a smaller market where you can own multiple units and be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. Whichever path you choose, use this episode as a starting point. Dive into the specific tenancy laws for your target province or territory, talk to a local professional, and run the numbers carefully. With the right knowledge and preparation, Canada's diverse provinces and territories offer a wide range of opportunities for landlords. But remember, once again, landlord friendly doesn't always mean tenant unfriendly. The best markets balance protective laws with fair process for both sides. Good tenants are business partners, not cash machines. Treat them well, and you'll reap consistent low turnover returns, no matter the jurisdiction. Thanks for listening. And if you found this episode helpful, consider sharing it with another landlord, another tenant, another investor, or leaving a comment or review. We're recording this episode today in San Antonio, Texas. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you?